Hey YouTube, what's up? Mike the Manic Geek here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the InWin 901. This is a mini ITX case that came out for them a little while ago, but I'm just now getting around to taking a look at it. And it's kind of an interesting case to build in. I'm going to be taking a look at this in the typical way, look at the outwards, move over to the innards, get some hardware in here, and give you guys my take on what it's like to actually build in this case, and whether or not it's really worth the sort of lofty premium that this commands. So, starting with the outside of the case, we can see that the exterior is largely a single piece of brushed aluminum that's been rolled around itself to sort of make the outside of the case shape. Really the only defining feature on the outside being the InWin logo that does light up in white when the system is powered on. You have some pretty typical I/O here, power switch, your hard drive activity lights, your headphone and microphone jack, and then your two USB 3.0 ports. As well, on the bottom, there is room for a slot-loaded Blu-ray or DVD drive should you desire one in the case. The fact that you're restricted specifically to slot-loaded kind of turns me off from ever wanting to do that in the first place, but it's still nice to see that option present, where a lot of other cases leave out something like this for people that do have a physical media collection and want to use this for something like a home theater computer. Moving around to the back of the case, we have the only break in the exterior, which is a panel that's held in place by 4 thumb screws, which are attached to the panel and spring-loaded. Very nice touch. This panel gives you access to the rear I/O on your motherboard, as well as the I/O for a graphics adapter should you install one, as well as allowing you to install up to a 120mm water cooling radiator on this panel. Now, you will have to mount at least the radiator on the outside of the panel in order to mount one here, possibly the radiator and the fan, depending on how everything is configured and how much cable length or tubing length you actually have coming from the radiator. Now, the side panels on this case are smoked tempered glass. They are gorgeous. They are fingerprint magnets, just like the rest of the case. Handle the panels with care. It's not particularly fragile glass, but it is still prone to etching, especially with the 4 thumb screws that are used on either side to secure the panels in place. The screws themselves don't have washers on the end of the head, so what happens is if you tighten the screws down too much, you could wind up leaving little etches in the glass. So just be careful with that and be mindful of it if you should decide to build in this case and you're handling it moving forward. Now, moving to the interior of the case, there's room for up to 2 3.5-inch hard drives and 2 2.5-inch hard drives, all mounted in place with a toolless thumb screw system, once again with the thumb screws captive in their respective brackets. I'm really happy to see so much toolless implementation on the interior of this case. It makes the building experience in here a whole lot less trouble than it could have been otherwise. There is room for a single 120mm intake fan up front. Unfortunately, no radiator fitment will be allowed up here. Also, you might want to use a static pressure fan up front. InWin doesn't supply any fans with this case, which is something of a turnoff for most people, but what I found was when I populated the front with a Fractal Design Venturi fan that I have on hand, I noticed that the fan was making noticeably more noise than what it typically made in all of my other testing scenarios, not including when I mounted them to a radiator. So high impedance environments aren't good for that fan, and they're not good for any other fan that you're going to sit in here, because this front intake here with the dust filtering and with the cables from front I/O creates an environment where the fan's hard pressed to breathe. So use a high static pressure fan up here and you should be fine. The rest of the interior is intelligently laid out with a cubby up front to stash away some of your unwanted cables. I would have liked to have seen this area blocked off, perhaps in a future revision. I don't know about you guys, but if I'm building a system in a case like this with an entirely glass side panel to it, even if it is tinted, I want an eyesore like this to be as hidden as is physically possible. Now, there is room for up to an ATX length power supply down here. This particular case came with an InWin 750 watt 80 plus gold power supply. It does include all of the cables on it that you would need to build a system in here, as well as some semi-modular cables that come packaged with this case as well. It's not a terrible power supply. It definitely gets the job done. It's incredibly quiet. Now, if you're planning on doing a fully air-cooled build in the system and you want some kind of exhaust airflow, there is only room for a 90mm fan in the rear here. So bear that in mind when you're building in the system. Unfortunately, you are unable to mount just a fan on the outside of this case where you would mount a radiator unless you got very specialized fittings and fasteners to do that. Moving around to the back of the case, it's actually fairly Spartan back here, but the most interesting thing that we find is that for the two 3.5-inch hard drive slots, they do have pre-installed cabling for both power and data, also with braided cabling, just like the rest of all the included cables for the power supply and the case. So any of these drive bays that you're not using, you can just remove that bit of cabling and not have to worry about it. Or, if you do populate it with a hard drive, you've already got clean matching cabling to go with all the rest of the supplied cables. Not a bad touch, InWin. That being said, InWin, why did you leave the color of the front I/O cables themselves rainbow bright? Every other cable in this case, with the exception of the front audio header, nice black cabling, nice black sleeved cabling all around. Maybe the heat shrink is a little thick and difficult to bend for some system builds, but it's otherwise really nice looking. And all of it gets ruined by the necessary and rainbow colored front I/O cables. InWin, for a case that had such attention to detail paid to it, I feel like that one was an unnecessary step to skip, and I feel like your users would have appreciated solid black cabling there, whatever additional cost that might have added to tooling. I mean, they're already paying $130 for this chassis, another $5 or $10 to have those black cables for a build that's going to go in something like this probably wouldn't be amiss in the future. Now, I'm sure there's other logistics that go behind something like that, but just saying, we need to have those cables black because it really does break apart too much of what goes on inside, which I'll get to later. Now, cable management back here was actually an incredibly easy task. Now, as far as the supplied materials that they give you for the case, you get your typical baggy O fasteners, but they are intelligently labeled and laid out to make sure there's no way you could possibly mistake those fasteners for anything other than their intended purpose. They also give you some 3M mounted clips to mount as and where you feel you need to add them in the case. And I gotta say, everything came together very organically as far as cable management is concerned. It was just a sort of effortless task, with the exception of the front I/O cable, which I'm going to harp on for different reasons now, because ultimately it's too short. And I'll flip around the case now so you guys can go ahead and take a better look at what I'm talking about. So it's still very difficult to see from this angle, I'll admit, but I'll go ahead and show you guys a close-up here in a second so you can see better. The front I/O on this motherboard, which I'll also be conducting a review on soon, the front I/O is positioned kind of towards the interior of the board, away from this top edge here. And what happens is these cables have to be run extremely taut in order to reach them at all. Taut to the point that I was worried I might damage a pin on the motherboard in the process of connecting them. Ultimately, it proved not to be a problem, but this is mostly just a cautionary tale to advise you guys to be mindful of the motherboard layout for the motherboard you want to use in this case, because it will influence your ability to or not to use these cables. I might suggest a motherboard that has front I/O that's situated more towards the front of the case that it would be mounting in rather than towards the top. Ultimately, though, I have to admit, a completed system in this case looks absolutely gorgeous. All of the cabling runs, as previously mentioned, were effortless, stupid easy to do. and everything cleans up extremely nicely. The focus is all on the hardware here. The cables are so out of the way as to not even be the point of this case. The point of this case is to craft a very specifically sourced PC that has hardware that creates a very striking and eye-catching look. Because the rest of the case is very subdued, right? We're talking just plain brushed aluminum exterior and some really dark tempered glass. But you get some white LEDs in here, and you get up something like a black and gold system where the gold's sort of standing out against the rest of the case in a very tasteful sort of way. That makes an extremely eye-catching build. And it's so eye-catching that my fiance has actually claimed this case as her own. So her next build is going to be going in the InWin 901 here. Get yourself high-quality hardware for this. High-quality, quiet hardware for this. This is not a quiet case by any stretch of the imagination, so this is just going to amplify the sound of whatever it is you put in here. So if you have one noisy piece of hardware, it's suddenly going to become extremely noisy in this case. Just keep that in mind. And if you do, I promise you will have just as enjoyable a build experience as I did with this case and be able to put something together even more attractive than what I've got going on right here. And I gotta say, even as a home theater computer, she's quite the looker. So anyway, guys, that was my take on the InWin 901. Hope you guys found it informative. I certainly give it a thumbs up in my book. It's got some quirks to it, but it's definitely worth building in if you can appreciate this kind of design aesthetic, as well as appreciate some of the spatial limitations that a case like this offers. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Can you justify $130 for an ITX case that can't even hold a single 240mm radiator? So go ahead and do that thumbs up, thumbs down, share, subscribe thing like you do, how you do. And as always, I'll catch you guys next time. Take it easy, YouTube.